From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. Look, let's just get this out there. It's a nervous and deeply uncertain time for everyone. And there's a lot for us to worry about. In a matter of days, we went from leading our normal, everyday lives to thousands of confirmed coronavirus cases across Canada. It's led to a near total shutdown of our society and the closure of our national borders.
I just spoke to President Trump again this morning, and we have agreed that both Canada and the United States will temporarily restrict all non-essential travel across the Canada-US border.
This coronavirus pandemic is a once-in-a-generation worldwide emergency, and the full gravity of that realization can be hard to wrap our heads around.
The end of the line for the toilet paper and paper towels is right here.
You've seen it for yourself. Massive lines at the grocery store and empty shelves, people hoarding toilet paper, pasta, hand sanitizer, whatever they can get their hands on. The fear that's taken hold in some cases has turned to xenophobia. After the coronavirus's origin was traced back to Wuhan, China, businesses owned by Chinese Canadians saw a huge downturn in business as reports of racist incidents have gone up.
So my mom is a nurse at a Toronto hospital. A patient had come up to her and asked for a mask. She has to ask the patient, "Why do you need a mask?" And the patient replied to her, "There are just so many Chinese people here, I need a mask."
Many Canadians are acting logically and staying calm. Millions of us are listening to the advice of our doctors and public health officials by socially distancing and self-isolating at home. But there's no doubt that fear of the virus, of what comes next, is driving our thoughts and our behavior. So why do we act this way? What happens to our brains during a pandemic? Today, we're talking to clinical psychologist Stephen Taylor from the University of British Columbia. He's literally written the book on this very idea. It's called The Psychology of Pandemics. Stephen, thanks for talking to us from your living room, I take it?
Yes, thanks very much, Adrian.
You've spent years studying how we react and what goes through our minds when a pandemic strikes. So what went through your mind as the coronavirus was first gaining steam in Wuhan, and then you realized that this was becoming a worldwide problem?
What went through my mind was I was impressed how everything was unfolding the way it had unfolded in previous pandemics. So the initial rise in xenophobia and racism, then the spike in anxiety when a pandemic was officially declared, then the rush to panic buying. I was taken aback. We've seen all of this before.
Mm-hmm. And there are lessons to be learned from that.
There are, but we haven't been very good at learning the lessons of the past. We tend to be fairly myopic. Once one pandemic is over, people tend to forget about it and then go off and focusing on whatever else is in their busy life. We've learned a few lessons, but we haven't learned much. We've learned that we need to be careful about what we call a pandemic. The naming of it is very important, and that's where I think the WHO did a good job in calling it COVID-19. If you name it after a person, place, or thing, that can have all kinds of problems. For example, if we call it Wuhan bat flu, it would have been a disaster. It would have incited racism, and it would have incited the needless culling of animals. And that's happened in previous pandemics where they've named them after things. So we've learned that and the importance of how health authorities communicate with the public. Health authorities need to be perceived as credible and trustworthy in order for the public to follow what they recommend. If our leaders are seen as unreliable or not trustworthy, that can incite widespread anxiety. So I think the WHO did a really good job this time around. They were seen as transparent. They released information in a timely fashion. They acknowledged uncertainties. That's important to do, and talked about ways of resolving those uncertainties. So there are some lessons we've learned. But we can think of COVID-19 as being a preparation for the next pandemic, because there will be another pandemic, who knows how soon. But we should really be learning the lessons that we acquire now and use that as the basis of a preparedness plan for the next pandemic.
The developments here are happening all pretty drastically. What actually happens to our brains when we're faced with a pandemic?
Well, Yeah, people vary. Some people cope really well, and many people cope well. People in general tend to be resilient. But that said, some people develop excessive anxiety around this, and one of the things that is particularly anxiety-provoking for many people are the many uncertainties. The uncertainty about the nature of the virus, the uncertainty about how bad it could get, uncertainty about when it's truly over, uncertainty about treatments. And also, of course, now we're seeing where social isolation is being more widely implemented, uncertainties about the economic fallout of all this, because some people have been experiencing financial hardship around the social distancing.
One of the first and clear signs of our collective panic around the world, at least initially, was to panic buy and hoard items like toilet paper and hand sanitizer. Why do you think we do this?
It's a coping response. People feel the need to do something. Here we're faced with this special threat which not a lot is known about, COVID-19, and the public is told you just need to go and wash your hands and self-isolate. And I think in the minds of many people that just wasn't enough. Here we have a special problem, and we're told to do ordinary things. People felt they need to do something to feel in control, to give them a sense of agency, as it were. And panic buying is one of those things where people feel like they're doing something to protect themselves and protect their families. But unfortunately, that thing that they're doing is creating social disruption and actual real hardship for people who don't have the financial resources to go out and stockpile.
Mm-hmm. So it's really about us trying to control a situation that feels completely out of our control.
Exactly. That's what it is.
What are the two sides of our brain in how we process this? You've written about a rational part of our mind and then a primal part too.
Yeah. Well, we're social animals and we imitate one another. That's how fashion trends arise and so forth. And when we're in a group of people and we see other people acting in a frightened manner, then we pick up cues from other people. Oh, those people are buying large quantities of groceries. Maybe there's something wrong. Maybe I'd better stock up too. And if you interview some of these shoppers after they leave the store with all their over-purchasing and ask them, why did you do it? Some of them say, I don't know, I did it because everyone else was doing it. So there's that almost instinctual follow the herd sort of mentality. And to overcome that problem, people need to kind of engage their brains, as it were. They need to step back and say, okay, I need to inoculate myself against this herd mentality. I'm going to go into a store. I'm going to see panicky people over-purchasing. That's going to give me the urge to over-purchase. I just need to step back and buy what I realistically need. So they need to prepare themselves in that kind of way.
So that fear really, in turn, is cyclical, then, is what you're saying, is that we see other people doing this, and then we think, okay, I should panic too. That's the primal, guttural part of how we think.
Exactly. And the whole thing can snowball. This fear of scarcity and the sense of urgency can create real scarcity. And I think what has made this pandemic different in many ways from past pandemics is social media and internet connectivity. So we're all connected to one another. And so we're seeing images of people panic buying, say, one country, and that can influence how we behave in another country.
I know at the outset of this, when you're talking about the herd mentality, I was comparing my reaction to that of everyone else. And I think that's the case for many people. You know, I was asking myself, am I prepared enough? Should I be even more worried? In these very abnormal times, is there actually a normal or rational way of coping with news of the coronavirus?
Probably no single way of coping with it. I guess one way in which people do cope is to listen to what the health authorities say, to be mindful that your behavior influences the behavior of other people. So if you act panicky, you're going to incite panic in other people, and to purchase sensibly.
What is an example of excessive coping? You're talking about normal ways before, but you've also written about what excessive coping mechanisms look like.
Well, over-purchasing, panic buying is one form of self-defeating coping that can create more problems than it solves. Another example is what happens when people are in self-isolation. Some people engage in maladaptive coping. They're feeling bored, they're feeling stressed, so they might abuse drugs or alcohol or overeat or engage in online shopping, which creates financial difficulties. So sometimes people's coping behaviors create more problems than they solve.
You talked about this a little bit off the top, too, of how important it is that we name this properly, that especially when it comes to the authorities. You've written about how xenophobia really begins to grow in pandemic times. We've seen that play out with how, at least initially, Chinese businesses and restaurants, they had a huge downturn in the beginning.
As if losing money wasn't enough, Chinese businesses have faced racism, including this restaurant, which makes Wuhan noodles.
Even U.S. President Donald Trump, he's called it the Chinese virus in his tweets.
It's not racist at all. No, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. It comes from China.
Why does that begin to happen? Why does xenophobia and fear of other people begin to take hold sometimes?
Well, humans are fundamentally tribal in nature. And from an evolutionary perspective, if tribes of people, the deadly diseases have been brought in by foreigners. Think, for example, of European explorers going to the Americas. They brought diseases with them, such as smallpox and influenza, for which the indigenous people had no immunity and just decimated the populations. So it's almost as if we have this instinct to be wary of strangers. And for some people, that's a stronger instinct than for other people. And so when people get threatened with infection, for some people, they have an increased xenophobia. And that can be directed towards foreigners, but also towards anyone who vaguely resembles something associated with illness. In the SARS pandemic, for example, there was discrimination and avoidance and shunning of healthcare workers because people feared that they might be somehow associated with infection.
Does it also link to an idea that sometimes we're looking for something concrete to blame rather than something we can't see?
Yeah, that makes a person's world more understandable and controllable if you can target the source of blame to a given group or individual. And rightly or wrongly, people tend to do that.
Mm-hmm. Many of us are in self-isolation, at least for the next few weeks. Essentially, all Canadians right now are practicing social distancing, or at least we should be. That's been the advice of basically every public health official and many governments that are dealing with this. But until there were big closures of restaurants and bars and public spaces, we still saw many people congregating in big groups, traveling around the world, going on March break trips.
It's really messing up with my spring break. They're closing all of it. It's really messing up. I think they're blowing it way out of proportion.
This virus ain't that serious.
At the end of the day, I'm not going to let it stop me from partying.
You hear some talk online from some people that it's overblown, that the media is driving this panic. So here's the flip side of that. Why do people not listen to the advice of doctors? Is there some fundamental mistrust of science by some?
Some people have a fundamental mistrust of science, and some people have what's called an over-optimism bias. They see themselves as being more invulnerable than the average person, better able to deal with health threats. And so the people who are flocking out to the bars and partying or congregating in groups, they might be aware of COVID-19, but they see themselves as either impervious to it, or if they did get it, they think they would recover would only have mild illness. And the problem with that is, of course, these people are likely to spread infection to others.
Right. It's self-fulfilling in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one reason for closing bars and so forth, to prevent this. Different demographics are impacted differently by COVID-19. So the elderly, the seniors, are at greater risk of mortality from the virus, whereas it seems that some of the younger people are at greater risk for financial impacts, particularly the people in the service industry who work from paycheck to paycheck, who don't have a financial cushion to fall back on. But they're the people who aren't worried about getting infected because they see themselves as healthy and impervious to infection. But they're the ones some of them are worrying about their finances, so they're more economically impacted.
And that, again, when it comes to even different age groups, you're saying that's where that over-optimism bias plays in, that some people think, well, I'm not going to get sick, or if I do, it won't be that big of a deal for me, and that's where that kind of feeds in?
Yeah, exactly. Their reasoning might be, I'm not going to get sick, or if I did, I'd be fine, but I'm being economically impacted by social distancing. And there's the concern that people who hold those sorts of attitudes will violate social distancing, will go out and therefore make it more difficult to contain the spread of infection.
What role does government play in helping ease this fear, or at least trying to make sure that the right information is getting out there?
Well, governments need to be seen as trustworthy and reliable, and therefore people are likely to listen to their messages, and they need to be transparent in that regard. So that's important. They need to be seen as doing something to combat the spread of infection, and they need to be, if a government or health leaders are seen in that regard, it's going to allay people's anxieties.
Mm-hmm. Especially in self-isolation and enclosures of borders of our normal day life. If this goes on for more than the initial 2 to 3 weeks, if it goes on for a lot longer than that, how do you think that this might affect our mental health?
That's an interesting question. We don't know about the long-term impacts, but we do know that people are typically resilient. Most people are resilient to stresses, and this social isolation comes with a series of stresses. There's the financial or economic side of it, but there's also the boredom and so forth. But people are resilient and adaptive, and we're seeing this already, that people are planning what they'll do. They're generating schedules for themselves. So some people seem to be coping quite nicely with social isolation despite it being stressful. Other people, not so much. And they're often the people who don't make a plan, who think they can just sit down in front of the TV and have snacks and watch Netflix and that will be fine. They find out very quickly by day 3 that's getting very boring and they're getting stressed out. So you get a bunch of different reactions.
This is something that we have to be consciously preparing for. Even when we're in self-isolation, there is work to be done here.
Exactly. We need to plan for things, especially if you're in crowded quarters with one or more other people. You need to plan for what are we going to do when we get on each other's nerves. So you need to have that conversation early when you're both feeling calm. Okay, this is our plan. If I start to feel cranky, then I will do this, or I will go to the other room. So you plan it out before things escalate. So self-isolation does require a fair bit of planning.
So, Stephen, we now know all about how our brains can react to a pandemic, and I kind of want to end on a hopeful note here. How do we fight back against our worst impulses?
Self-knowledge goes a long way, and this is why we should learn the lessons of COVID-19 and understand how people react. We need to understand how we can use social media, because social media is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, these scary images can incite anxiety, but on the other hand, social media is a great resource for pulling people together. I think one of the positive things that we can learn is that the overwhelming response during a pandemic is altruism, of people coming together. And even though people might be distanced, isolated in their own apartments or houses, people are reaching out to one another, texting and so forth. So that's an important thing.
Stephen, thank you so much for all your expertise on this.
Thanks very much.
And that is Stephen Taylor. He is a clinical psychologist at the University of British Columbia. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.